Hello.
Story 1. Upon reaching the age of 16, I encountered difficulty in making a decision regarding the type of employment I should pursue. I harbored no particular enthusiasm for occupations commonly found in fast food establishments or retail stores, yet at that specific stage of life, the array of available choices was quite limited. While I possessed prior experience in childcare, it had been exclusively for acquaintances of my parents. My mother put forth the suggestion that I consider undertaking babysitting as a part-time vocation for individuals beyond our immediate circle, and given the absence of other more appealing alternatives, I ultimately accepted her counsel. Within my town, there operated a local childcare placement service, which facilitated connections between individuals seeking babysitting work and parents in search of caregivers. I participated in an interview and was subsequently approved to commence working with this service, which proved to be significantly beneficial because my personal network was not extensive enough to generate sufficient income. I remained employed there for a period of 2 months, and the primary drawback was the near constant necessity of babysitting for a different family on each occasion. Most often, the parents were simply going out for a special evening or similar event, meaning they did not have a regular need for my services. Eventually, one of the families for whom I had previously babysat scheduled another appointment with me. It was a single father who was raising his daughter, Alyssa. My only recollection of him was that he was not particularly talkative. His forthcoming appointment was scheduled to run from 6 in the evening until exactly 10 at night. Therefore, precisely at 6 o'clock, I drove my vehicle into his driveway and proceeded to knock on his front door. He opened the door and made a gesture indicating for me to enter. I stepped inside, and Alyssa appeared from around a corner to greet me. Subsequently, the father provided me with very specific and rather unusual instructions for the duration of the evening. He stated that he would return precisely at 10 p.m., but emphasized that I needed to depart a few minutes prior to his arrival. I simply nodded my head and affirmed, "Okay, no problem," but after he had left, I gave the matter more thought. It was indeed a bizarre request, and I was unable to ascertain why he would be so stringent about that particular timing. During the period I spent babysitting Alyssa, we engaged in all the customary activities. We played a selection of games, watched some of her preferred television programs, and consumed a modest dinner. At one point, she briefly napped on the sofa, and I made the decision to walk around the interior of the house. This was not for any invasive reason, but merely to ensure that everything appeared normal. The father's demeanor had instilled a sense of unease within me, so observing that the house was unremarkable provided a measure of reassurance. However, upon further contemplation, I found myself uncomfortable with the idea of leaving the house before his return. It did not feel appropriate, and his request had made the situation seem somewhat unsettling. Consequently, a few minutes before 10 p.m., I escorted Alyssa upstairs and prepared her for bed. Then I settled onto the couch downstairs to await the father's arrival. I anticipated that he would likely cast a disapproving glance my way or inquire as to why I was still present, but I was confident that he would comprehend my reasoning if I offered an explanation. I meticulously monitored the time on my mobile phone. Precisely at 10 o'clock, I gazed out the window towards the driveway, expecting him to arrive home. Several minutes elapsed, yet he still had not appeared. Then, an additional 5 minutes passed, and he remained absent from the residence. This situation was particularly peculiar given how explicit he had been about being home at precisely 10 and his desire for me to depart early. At this juncture, I was certainly relieved that I had chosen to remain. Leaving Alyssa unattended for more than a few minutes, as he had suggested, would undeniably not have been safe. Once 20 minutes had gone by, I attempted to contact him by phone. The phone rang for a considerable duration before he eventually answered. "Hey, I just wanted to check in and make sure everything was okay. I'm still here waiting for you to come home," I stated. There was a prolonged silence. Then he spoke. "I told you to leave before 10. Please go home now." I was unsure how to formulate a response, but then he appended, "I'm waiting for you to leave." I uttered a shaky, "Okay," then disconnected the call. Things were rapidly escalating into a truly unsettling experience, and I felt profoundly uncomfortable remaining within the house, but even more so about the prospect of leaving Alyssa alone inside. I resolved to contact the police. I had no further communication with the father during the 10-minute interval I waited for the police to arrive. However, almost immediately upon their arrival, the father's vehicle pulled into the driveway as well. I provided a full account of myself and all the strange occurrences that had transpired. Yet, the father unequivocally denied ever instructing me to leave before his return or stating that he was waiting for me to depart. He asserted that he was merely running late and that during our phone conversation, he had informed me he would be home in a few minutes, nothing more. He granted them permission to inspect the premises, but nothing suspicious was discovered. No other incidents occurred, and they instructed me to return to my own residence. They informed me that even if I possessed proof of what he had said, they could not legitimately charge him with any offense unless it was connected to some other criminal activity. It causes me profound distress to consider that Alyssa continues to be alone with her father, who is undoubtedly involved in something suspicious. Otherwise, why would he exert such considerable effort to conceal it and lie about everything he had previously communicated to me? Story 2. When I was a child, I had a regular babysitter who was the daughter of one of my dad's colleagues. I somewhat disliked her at the time. She was terrible at her job. I had other babysitters whom I genuinely liked, so I knew she was truly awful. She appeared as though she simply did not wish to be there at all. She was always exceedingly strict with me, zealously adhering to my parents' rules precisely, seemingly as a way of expressing her spite towards me. Thus, I became accustomed to actions like first calling downstairs if I desired a glass of water after bedtime, or not even daring to activate my nightlight because she made me sleep with my door ajar so she could easily check on me. It sounds harsh, I know, but my parents were always quite strict too, and I suppose my dad's colleague believed their influence, along with the responsibility, would benefit her. Anyway, on this particular evening when the babysitter, Chloe, arrived, she seemed different. I remember Mia's mom and dad, poor naive souls that they were, telling her that it was acceptable if she felt unwell and wished to be driven back home. Chloe refused, simply stating that she felt a little weary and would take a nap once I had been put to bed. And indeed, she appeared exceedingly tired. She was nodding off as I was eating dinner, and was far more lenient than she usually was. I recall thinking that if she were like that every time she babysat me in the future, I would no longer dread her arrival. She actually forgot to put me to bed on time too, so I gained approximately 45 minutes of extra television time while she napped on the couch. For a while, she was actually sleeping with her phone held close to her face. I found it utterly amusing at the time, but if I had known what was truly transpiring, I would not have found it so entertaining. A few hours later, I awoke feeling incredibly thirsty. So, I poked my head into the hallway and began calling out to her, requesting permission to descend downstairs to get a glass of water, as we had agreed. Then, for the first time since she began babysitting me, there was no response when I called her name. There was no, "Oh my God, what do you want now?" No, "Go back to sleep, kid, geez." Nothing of that nature. There was complete silence, apart from the low hum of the television from downstairs, and I instinctively knew something was amiss. I just didn't know precisely what, so I headed downstairs to try to locate her. I grew up in a rather large home, one with both an upstairs and a downstairs bathroom. The downstairs bathroom door was only ever closed when it was in use, which led me to infer that Chloe was inside. I simply stood there at the door for a few seconds, actually somewhat concerned about the trouble I would incur for being downstairs after bedtime. But then it dawned on me that something had seemed off that night, that my babysitter was not feeling well, and that she herself might be in some kind of difficulty. I knocked on the door, called out her name again, only to discover that the door actually opened slightly under the force of my knock. People always locked the door when they used the bathroom down there. I mean, people were constantly moving around outside, so they always secured it. I knew something was wrong, so I pushed it open, and my babysitter was simply sitting there, toilet lid down, slumped back, with something protruding from her arm. I didn't even truly recognize it for what it was at that moment. I knew nothing about illicit substances, and the only injections I had ever received were with me facing away from it and flinching, so it's not as if I immediately identified the object. I thought she was asleep. I honestly just believed she was napping. I realized she was leaning back against the toilet, head slumped over, and that any adult in their right mind would have known something was amiss. But she also simply looked remarkably peaceful, so peaceful that I didn't wish to disturb her. I simply retrieved my glass of water, then returned to bed to drift back off to sleep. The next thing I knew, I awoke to the sound of Mia's mom screaming. And then the remainder of the night is somewhat indistinct for me. A flash of blue and red lights outside, and phone calls, and weeping and wailing. But then, almost equally distressing, was how Mia's mom and dad simply seemed to attempt to erase the entire incident from their minds. I believe they did it for my sake, so I would not comprehend how my inaction had been the contributing factor in this young woman's demise. That if I had only contacted someone, raised the alarm in any manner, there might have been a chance that she would still be alive. Story 3. In October of 2012, 6-year-old Elena Vance and 2-year-old Max Vance were residing with their parents, Isabella and Paul Vance, at the Grand Plaza apartment building on the downtown San Francisco. The Vance family had relocated to Bay Area from Western Seaboard in 2010 after Paul secured employment as a digital content executive at the television network Global Media Corporation. Isabella Vance, on the other hand, was a former kindergarten teacher who had become a stay-at-home mother, dedicating her time to teaching art and meticulously documenting her children's lives through a series of video blogs. There is no doubt that Isabella was an exceptionally devoted mother. However, she could not be present for all her children, all of the time. And this is where Sofia Vargas enters the narrative. Originally from San Pedro de Alcantara in Costa Rica, Vargas was a 50-year-old naturalized U.S. citizen during October of 2012. She resided on Bayview Avenue in San Jose's Mission District along with her 17-year-old son, Rafael, her sister, and her niece. To support them, she gained employment as the Vance family's babysitter for $18 an hour. By October of 2012, Vargas had served as the Vance family's babysitter for almost 2 years and had earned the complete trust of both Isabella and her husband. So much so that Isabella entrusted her to take her 6-year-old Elena to her dance lessons. One of their usual routines involved Vargas taking Elena to her dance lessons, while Isabella would accompany 3-year-old Mia to the girls' swimming lessons at the nearby local community center. After Elena's dance lesson concluded, Isabella was to bring Mia to the dance venue, meet Vargas, and they would all return to the Vance apartment together to have dinner. Yet, on October 25, 2012, when Isabella arrived at the dance venue to meet Vargas, she discovered that neither Elena nor her babysitter had arrived for the dance lesson. Confused, Isabella headed back to the Grand Plaza apartment, assuming that Elena was feeling unwell and that there was some other legitimate reason for her absence from the lesson. However, when she arrived home, she walked into every parent's worst nightmare. She expected the apartment to be occupied and for a concerned Vargas to rush to her with an explanation as to why Elena failed to attend her dance lesson. Yet, as Isabella walked inside, the lights were off, almost as if no one was home. Isabella called out for her children and then called out for Vargas, but there was no reply. So, instead of immediately investigating the rest of the apartment, she went back downstairs to the building's doorman to inquire about her children. Upon being questioned, it was the doorman's turn to express confusion. He had seen Sofia Vargas as she and the children had stepped into the building's elevator just a few hours before. To his knowledge, they hadn't left the building either, not by the front entrance, anyway, so there was no reason why they shouldn't still be inside the Vance apartment. Isabella began to realize that something was wrong, but the extent of the horror that awaited her was something she could have never expected. Isabella returned to the apartment to search high and low for any sign of her children and their babysitter. Then, when she arrived in one of the family's bathrooms, she let out a blood-curdling scream that was thick with grief. Lying in the bathtub in a pool of their own blood were the lifeless bodies of 2-year-old Max and 6-year-old Elena. It was a sight that just about anyone would have found sickeningly horrifying, but for a mother to witness her own children in such a state, it was enough to drive Isabella to madness. Yet the horror wasn't over, not by a long shot. Kneeling next to the bathtub, the bloody knife still in her grip, was Sofia Vargas. She had been in what amounted to a catatonic state until Isabella had walked into the bathroom. But the grief-stricken mother's scream dragged Sofia out of her trance, with the reality of her actions hitting her with all the force of a runaway freight train. Sofia looked up at Isabella, then down at the children. Then, after unleashing a banshee's scream of her own, she jammed the knife into one of her wrists and began sawing up her own forearm. Before Isabella could even react to what Sofia was doing, the once loyal babysitter brought the knife up to her throat and opened it up with a deep slash that left blood streaming down her chest. Thankfully, Isabella was being accompanied by the apartment building superintendent, who promptly contacted emergency services when he realized what was happening. It was far too late to save the children, but the EMTs were able to stabilize the gruesome injuries that Sofia Vargas had inflicted on herself, saving her life to ensure that she would stand trial for the demonic crimes she had committed. Paul Vance, the children's father, didn't learn of their deaths until that evening when he returned from a business trip that had taken him back to Western Seaboard. And to say he was devastated would amount to the understatement of the century. Once she was physically well enough to be questioned, Vargas was alarmingly forthcoming with her motive for murdering the children. She claimed that she was deeply upset that the Vance family had rejected her request for more working hours, and that she desperately needed the money, and that the refusal was tantamount to a death sentence for her. However, the Vance family claimed that they had not actually refused to pay her more money and had instead offered Vargas a pay raise if she started doing housework for them during her non-babysitting hours. Indeed, Vargas's own family seemed to dismiss the idea that denying her a raise was the motive for the murders, as she was treated very well by the Vance family. On one occasion, the Vance family paid for Vargas's plane tickets to see her family in Costa Rica, and in another instance, had joined her on vacation there. She was also said to be extremely close to Elena and Max, and that the trio had a deeply loving and affectionate relationship as a result of almost 2 years of near constant companionship. This led investigators to theorize that Vargas may have suffered some kind of manic episode, as surely no sane person in her position would have been able to inflict such hideous violence on two innocent children. It was argued that evidence of such a manic or dissociative episode was how Vargas seemed to snap back to reality upon hearing Isabella Vance's screams. Investigators argued that once she realized what she'd done, attempting to take her own life was the only viable solution for her. After extensive psychoanalysis at a Bayview City psychiatric hospital, Sophia was later found mentally competent to stand trial for the murders of 2-year-old Max and 6-year-old Elena. Yet it would take 5 long years to bring her to trial. During that time, Vargas would make over 90 separate court appearances. She opted for a psychiatric defense, claiming she had no memory of the murders and could not explain what happened that afternoon which led to the deaths of the children. Therefore, it seemed perfectly reasonable to her to plead not guilty to the counts of first-degree murder and reject a number of plea deals that would have resulted in lesser sentences than life in prison. Finally, on May 14, 2018, Sofia Vargas was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In his final ruling, the presiding judge labeled her as pure evil and dismissed her claims that she wasn't responsible for her behavior. In the aftermath of the children's murder, the Bay State Assembly and State Senate passed the Elena and Max's Protection Act. The first of its kind in the entire U.S., the Elena and Max's Protection Act made it a criminal offense to deliberately misrepresent the mental health of a person applying to work as a child caregiver. No such legislation will bring Max or Elena back from the dead. But we can always hope that it might deter such things from happening in the future. Yet, following their murders, the significant question that seems to persist is, what exactly drove Sofia Vargas to kill 2 children she had come to love so deeply? While it may seem like a compelling argument that her mental health was to blame, Vargas had absolutely no history of anxiety or depression aside from a few familial anecdotes. It seems clear to most that the psychiatric defense was simply her attorney's last best hope to secure her a reduced sentence. After all, she had been their babysitter for 2 years with 0 complaints regarding her behavior. And she had become a trusted member of the Vance family circle by the time of the murders. Sofia herself claims she has no memory of the murders, and while this might seem like an awfully convenient aspect of her psychological defense, we cannot rule out that she experienced some kind of blackout and committed the murders while in some dissociative state. But then what else would cause such a blackout? Medical professionals ruled that Sofia had no kind of ongoing psychological condition at the time of her arrest. But what if she's telling the truth about not remembering the murders? What if something that medical science isn't quite ready to explain yet took Sofia over? Of course, such a theory might sound like the stuff of fiction. But there was a time in recent history when the idea that tiny, microscopic life forms were responsible for causing disease was dismissed by those who saw themselves as the educated elite. Time may explain Vargas's behavior by something deemed chilling but feasible, when at the present time, such a concept is too terrifying to even contemplate. Story 4. Back in 1951, 15-year-old Emily Miller of Seattle, Washington, needed to earn a little extra money. And like many young women of her age during that period, babysitting was the most reliable method of earning a few extra dollars. We often conceive of babysitting as a safe, family-oriented occupation, something that borders on wholesome. So when Emily first met the husband and wife couple, Laura and Ken Chang, and they proved to be friendly, affable individuals, she was delighted at the prospect of regularly working for them. But what Emily never could have anticipated was for her to become embroiled in a world of secrets, deception, illicit substance use, and bloodthirsty criminality. By January 6 of 1954, Emily had been babysitting for the Changs for 3 years and had essentially become part of their extended family. Emily had purchased a shirt as a Christmas gift for Ken Chang, who sometimes used the anglicized name of Kirk. But almost a week into the new year, she still hadn't presented him with it. When she called Laura Chang on the phone and asked if she could stop by to drop it off at their home, Laura invited her over for dinner. After obtaining her mother's permission to head over to their house, Emily joined the Changs and another couple named the Johnsons, while the Changs' children slept in the adjacent room. The Johnsons stayed only for drinks while Laura Chang prepared dinner, and when it was time for them to depart, they remarked on what a delightful young woman the Changs had found to babysit their children. Little did they know, their first meeting with Emily was also to be their last, as they would never see her alive again. Before she disappeared, 2 people spoke to Emily on the phone that night. The first was a friend of hers named Sarah Davies, who apparently heard that Emily was having a party and that she was under the influence of something. Not long after, Emily called her mother, informing her that she would be home as soon as Kirk Chang returned from an errand, as he had promised to give her a ride home. Around an hour later, she once again called her mother, stating that she would be home later than expected as Mr. Chang had yet to return. Her father then suggested that she spend the night there, a suggestion that Emily agreed with. It was a brief and seemingly inconsequential conversation, but it was the last one Emily and her father would ever have. The following day, when Emily failed to return home, her parents contacted the local police department to report her missing. Almost immediately, the police appealed to the public, pleading for information while releasing a steady stream of details to aid in the search. However, a great deal of gossip began to circulate regarding Emily's lifestyle, gossip which painted her in a very negative light, tainting public opinion of her. For example, some claimed it was common knowledge in certain circles that Emily had recently had a baby out of wedlock. Rumors also abounded that she regularly smoked cannabis while listening to subversive jazz music. The revelation caused deep outrage among the more pious sections of the local community, who quickly withdrew their support for Emily's search. Yet, a great number remained terrified and heartbroken by the striking 6-foot-tall teenager's disappearance and pledged themselves to find her wherever she might be. Story 5. Back in November of 2015, a woman by the name of Olivia Hayes realized that her living situation was simply untenable. She no longer felt safe around her domineering housemate she was living with in Green Valley, California. And given that she had 2 young daughters to support and protect, she quickly began looking for alternate forms of accommodation. Olivia began taking on a great deal of overtime in order to save up for a deposit on a place in the Pacific Coast region. But it's also worth noting that the reason she began working so extensively is because she knew that once she moved out, her tyrannical housemate would make it extremely difficult to retrieve her belongings. In Olivia's eyes, it was better to avoid any kind of confrontation that might result in harm to herself or her children, and with that in mind, the solution was simple: work her utmost to secure a strong financial situation, then hire a babysitter to take care of her daughters while she was away from home. This is how husband and wife babysitters Lena and George Peterson became young Clara's full-time caregivers. The 2 families quickly developed a deep rapport, and Olivia would later describe the Petersons as being supportive, friendly, and especially helpful at a time when she needed it most. The arrangement was a purely informal one. No papers or contracts were ever signed or agreed upon, but that suited the tremendously busy Olivia, who was sometimes sleeping less than 4 or 5 hours a night just to keep up with work while she looked for a new place to live. In order to provide her with a more stable kind of home life, 2-year-old Clara would often stay overnight at the Petersons' place in Lakeside City, California. Between commuting to her work in Bayview City, working overtime, finding a place to stay in the Pacific Coast region, and balancing everyday life, Olivia would visit Clara as much as she could. Finally, in February of 2016, Olivia received the good news that she had been waiting for. One of Olivia's co-workers invited her and Clara to move into her apartment in Bayview City, a place just minutes away from Olivia's place of work. It was as close to an ideal result as she could have ever wished for. But when she contacted the Petersons with the good news, they seemed less than pleased for her. Olivia must have been painfully confused at the reaction. They were so close by that point that she had expected them to be elated for her. But Lena greeted the news with an almost muted, indifferent tone. It wasn't anything like the reaction Olivia had been expecting, but her confusion soon grew into a deep anxiety with what followed. When Olivia tried to arrange a time and date to collect Clara, Lena Peterson simply hung up the phone and then refused to pick it up again. Olivia tried everything she could to get in touch with the Petersons, and it took 2 whole weeks before she was able to get them on the phone again. Towards the end of February, the Petersons told Olivia that the reason she couldn't collect her daughter was because they'd taken her to amusement park land and that they would contact her as soon as they were home so they could arrange a collection. Olivia remained extremely suspicious of this, but she apparently trusted the Petersons so much that she believed the excuse entirely. It kept her from contacting the police regarding any kind of potential kidnapping and stalled her long enough for them to keep hold of Clara for 6 weeks without letting Olivia see her. According to Olivia's new roommate, Sarah Thompson, it was only a matter of time before an increasingly desperate Olivia lost her patience and gave the Petersons a deadline. According to Sarah, Olivia snapped when she finally got them on the phone, saying something along the lines of, "Okay, April 3rd, I want my daughter. I'm coming to get her. She's coming to live with me." End of story. Olivia didn't have to wait that long, as on the night of April 1st, she told Sarah Thompson that the Petersons had been in touch with her. Sarah later said that Olivia had told her, "I have to meet my babysitter. She's over at some restaurant on Central Street. She's upset. I need to go see if she's okay." Olivia said she'd only be gone for 5 minutes, but hours came and went, and the young mother completely failed to return. In the early hours of the following morning, Sarah received a text from Olivia's phone at around 12:45 a.m. stating that she was on her way to Farmland County with a person named Samuel. Sarah had never heard Olivia mention a guy named Samuel before and demanded to know exactly who he was, but no reply came from her roommate's phone. Days passed with Olivia failing to reappear at Sarah's apartment, and so on April 5th of 2016, she and 2-year-old Clara were officially reported missing to the Bayview City Police Department. Just less than a week later, the Hayes family received the heartbreaking news that they prayed they'd never have to hear. Olivia's body was found curled up in a fetal position in a shallow grave located a few feet away from a children's play area. Her grave was covered with a plywood board, one with a symbol painted on one side that did not appear to originate from a location within the park. The police believed that the symbol might amount to a valuable clue in the search for her killers and begged anyone who recognized it to come forward. But to this day, not a single person has approached them with any pertinent information on the meaning of the symbol or who might have drawn it. The fact that Olivia had been found was of almost no comfort to her family, as not only was she deceased, but little Clara was still missing, presumably having been kidnapped by the Peterson family. To this day, Clara is still missing, and her location remains a complete mystery. Even more frustrating is the fact that the police have been completely unable to link the Petersons with Olivia's murder, meaning the people most likely to be responsible for her death are still walking the streets as free individuals. When questioned by law enforcement, the Petersons, as well as their immediate family members, have either given inconsistent statements regarding Clara's potential whereabouts or have refused to cooperate with the investigation entirely. Law enforcement conducted 3 full searches of houses belonging to friends or relatives of the Petersons in Harbor City, Lakeside City, and Green Valley, but were saddened to report that there was no sign of Clara anywhere. However, they did seize over 30,000 pieces of evidence which they claim might aid in the search for her, or, God forbid, a corpse. There is something extremely noteworthy regarding Lena Peterson's past, though, something we should all find extremely disturbing. Lena had once served a 6-year prison term for killing the father of her own child, a crime which had seen her child taken away from her and placed in the state foster system. Many have theorized that since she couldn't have her own child back, She simply murdered Olivia Hayes, then stole her daughter away and is keeping her somewhere secret to raise her as her own. It's a very compelling idea. After all, a woman willing to murder her own husband would have few qualms about killing someone she barely knew, especially if the goal was to realize her dreams of motherhood. As it stands, it's been over 6 long years since Clara was last seen alive, and police have started to release computer-generated images of how she might look at around 7 or 8 years old. We can only pray that these images help someone to identify her, that is, if she's even still alive to be recognized. Story 6. The narrator was raised in one of those small towns where nearly everyone knew each other, and residents traditionally left their doors unlocked without a second thought. Life simply felt more secure back then, or perhaps they were collectively more naive. When the narrator was approximately 14 years old, she had several regular babysitting assignments. One particular December night, one of the families she frequently assisted requested her to watch their 3 daughters while the mother attended a Christmas party. This arrangement was not unprecedented. The mother trusted her to stay late and had even informed her that if she did not return until after 3 a.m., it was acceptable, provided she had pre-booked a taxi. The girls were pleasant, and after some playtime and settling them into bed, the narrator went downstairs as the mother had suggested, since the upstairs television was broken. She recalled simply browsing through television channels for a couple of hours. It was likely around 1:30 in the morning when she picked up the cordless phone, possibly intending to call her mother or sister to inform them she would be home late. It was at that moment that she heard the front door upstairs creak open. This caught her off guard, as the mother typically entered quite quietly and would have immediately announced her presence if it were her. The narrator speculated that perhaps she had consumed too much alcohol, so she rose and began ascending the stairs. As she reached the top, she heard someone stumble, prompting her to quicken her pace, thinking the mother might have tripped. However, the instant she rounded the corner, her heart virtually froze. It was not the mother. 3 strangers stood in the entryway. A woman who was evidently inebriated, slumped halfway inside the doorway, and 2 men positioned behind her, who appeared as bewildered to see the narrator as she was to see them. The narrator inquired about their purpose, and the woman mumbled something about being there for a party. This explanation was clearly illogical, so the narrator then asked if they even knew the woman who resided there. When she uttered the homeowner's name, they seemed to have no familiarity with whom she was referring. One of the men scrutinized the narrator in a manner that made her feel deeply uncomfortable. He then inquired if she was there alone. The narrator was unwilling to answer that question. Her immediate concern was the 3 young girls sleeping upstairs, and she was absolutely resolute in preventing any harm from befalling them under her care. Instead of responding, she firmly informed them that there was no party at the residence and that they needed to depart. The intoxicated woman persisted in insisting they were at the correct address. It was then that the man who had asked about her being alone took a step toward her. At that precise moment, they all heard a beep, like a phone button being pressed. The narrator had completely forgotten she was still holding the cordless phone, but that subtle sound seemed to disconcert him. He must have presumed she had telephoned someone or dialed the police, because abruptly, he instructed the others that they were leaving. He seized the woman, directed his companion to assist, and they all somewhat awkwardly stumbled back outside. The moment the door closed, the narrator locked it with such rapidity that it likely rattled the doorframe. She hurried to the front window to observe their departure, initially thinking they might genuinely have mistakenly come to the wrong address. However, they did not halt. They simply continued walking down the block as if heading to a specific destination. It was then that the narrator realized they had not simply wandered into the incorrect house. They were definitively not supposed to be there. When the mother returned a couple of hours later, she was too inebriated to notice much. She expressed a slight surprise that the front door was locked, but the narrator simply stated that it made her feel more secure. She did not disclose the incident to the mother, not because she believed it was trivial, but because she felt somewhat foolish for not handling it differently or contacting law enforcement. She still often contemplates how much worse the situation could have become and remains grateful that it did not. Story 7. This narrative is one of those family stories that has been transmitted through generations, with everyone swearing to its veracity. The manner in which it has consistently been recounted sends chills down the narrator's spine each time. This event took place in a distant past, specifically predating the 1950s, in a minuscule town nestled deep within the Mexican countryside. It was characteristic of places where families possessed their own land, complete with chickens, crops, and all necessities. Each dwelling was spaced out, enjoying its own parcel of property. People utilized outhouses instead of indoor plumbing, and these structures were situated a considerable distance from the main house, approximately 20 to 40 meters away. Consequently, one had to traverse the darkness merely to use the facilities. One of the narrator's distant male relatives suddenly passed away without any prior indication or warning. No one had ever observed him being ill, not even experiencing a cough. Thus, his death came as a complete shock and deeply distressed everyone. The family did not delay. They buried him the following day in the backyard, a customary practice at that time. That very night, the narrator's mother's great-aunt, then a mere child, awoke with a need to use the bathroom. With the courage typical of a young child, she ventured outside alone toward the outhouse, necessitating her passage by the recently dug grave. As she drew nearer to it, she began to discern a muffled banging sound and someone screaming. It was not a shout indicative of a struggle, but rather a sound as though someone was pleading for assistance. It is important to remember that this occurred in a time and place where people were raised hearing legends such as La Llorona. Therefore, encountering such a sound in the darkness would naturally terrify anyone. Instinctively, she raced directly back into the house, trembling and weeping, and roused her parents. However, They presumed she was merely frightened by her imagination and instructed her to return to bed. She attempted to sleep but could not shake the feeling, particularly because the sounds persisted. It felt as though her mind was trying to convince her it was merely a dream, but her intuition insisted otherwise. A couple of hours later, she once again needed to use the bathroom but remained deeply frightened. Consequently, she awoke her older sibling and requested their accompaniment. The sibling agreed without hesitation, and both children proceeded together to the outhouse. While she was inside, both siblings distinctly heard the same cries, that identical, dreadful wailing sound, and neither of them paused. They simply ran at full speed directly back to the house. This time, when they awoke their parents, the parents believed them, primarily because the older sibling corroborated that it was not merely the younger child imagining things. Their father dressed, journeyed down the lane to his brother's residence, and woke him. The two men retrieved shovels and headed directly to the grave they had dug just hours before. They commenced digging slowly at first, then more frantically as the sound appeared to become clearer. When they finally reached the coffin and opened it, they were utterly horrified by what they witnessed. The body, which they had originally laid flat on its back, was now face down. And when they rolled him over, they nearly screamed. His face, neck, and arms were covered in deep scratches, as if he had been desperately clawing at the interior of the coffin in an attempt to escape. The wooden interior of the coffin was visibly shredded with claw marks and indentations, and it was undeniably evident that he had been very much alive when they interred him. The family speculates that he either suffered from a rare medical condition that caused his heart to slow sufficiently to mimic death, or perhaps he had been in a coma-like state and subsequently awakened underground. Regardless of the cause, he was definitively deceased by the time they reopened the coffin, most likely from suffocation or a heart attack induced by sheer panic. The narrator's family never discusses this topic casually. It remains one of those unsettling events that continues to haunt them.
Bye.